Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive with Saadi?
Always.
Last time we got a taste of his thoughts on humility, but today we're going even deeper, really looking at how our inner selves and our outer actions need to, well, match up.
It's a crucial aspect of Saadi's teachings.
Before we jump in, a quick reminder, this deep dive is based on translations, conversations with Iranian philosophers. So, something might get a little lost in translation along the way.
It's always a challenge with these rich philosophical texts.
Absolutely. But we'll do our best to capture the essence of Saadi's wisdom. Okay, so one thing that really struck me was this story about a man refusing to sweep a mosque because he felt, unworthy.
Interesting, right.
Yeah, on the surface, it's like,
Yeah.
shouldn't helping out, be a sign of humility?
That's where it gets fascinating. Saadi is pushing us to think about our motivations. Are we acting from a place of genuine humility, or are we, just trying to impress people?
Yeah.
Or maintain an image?
That story really highlights that true humility goes way beyond just outward actions. So you could, look humble on the outside.
But be driven by something totally different internally.
Exactly. And Saadi, he uses the word pollution to describe this disconnect, between our inner selves and how we act.
It's a powerful word, and it emphasizes how serious this is, this disharmony, especially from an Islamic perspective. Saadi even says, the stench of hypocrisy can reach the heavens.
Wow, okay. So it's not just about me being a little, fake.
It has a ripple effect.
My hypocrisy is actually contributing to a bigger problem.
Absolutely. It impacts everyone, not just the individual. Think about it. When appearances become more important than truth, well, trust breaks down, misinformation spreads. Saadi is urging us to really consider whether our actions are promoting sincerity or just adding to the hypocrisy.
Okay, I'm getting chills. So how do we, combat this internal pollution? I know Saadi uses that metaphor of dust and fire within us. What's that all about?
Ah, yes. That's a beautiful way to understand the duality within each of us. So dust, that represents our pure original nature. And then fire, that symbolizes, our ego, passions, desires, all that stuff.
Okay. So are we saying, we're born good, pure like dust?
Yeah.
But then we become vulnerable to, negative influences, the fire of ego?
It's not quite that simple. We have to remember that fire isn't always bad. Think about passion and creativity. Those are driven by fire, too. They give us energy and drive.
Ah, I see. So fire can be both, fuel good things and eat bad things.
Exactly.
But how do we make sure we're acting from the right place?
Mm-hmm.
From that pure essence of dust.
That's where free will comes in. Saadi emphasizes that we have the power to choose how we respond to these forces within us. We're not just puppets of our desires. We actively participate in shaping our lives.
That's pretty empowering. So it's not about getting rid of the fire altogether.
Not at all.
It's about harnessing it.
Exactly. And that's where Saadi's metaphor of polishing the mirror of the heart comes in. Oh, yes.
It's about cultivating self-awareness, clearing away the clouds of ego, desire, so we can see ourselves honestly.
Love that imagery. So we're talking about getting real with ourselves, confronting those less than perfect parts, and actually working on them.
That's the heart of it. It's about acknowledging our strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
Without judgment.
Yeah.
And constantly striving for growth. That's crucial for genuine humility.
Because, if we can't even see ourselves clearly,
right,
how can we expect to, grow or act with real humility? Makes you wonder how much self-deception is out there.
It's more common than we think, especially in a world that often rewards outward displays of, piety or virtue.
Right. Show, not substance.
But Saadi is urging us to go deeper, to cultivate a humility that's rooted in sincerity.
This really changes how I usually think about humility. It's not passive.
No.
It's about active self-reflection, making conscious choices. Exactly. Think back to that story about the mosque. It wasn't about the sweeping itself. It was about his heart being in it. He was holding himself to a higher standard, refusing to do something that looked humble if it wasn't genuine.
So he was challenging himself to make sure his intentions were, pure, not just going through the motions for show. That's a great example of how outward actions can be, misleading.
It is, and it's a reminder for all of us to examine our own motivations. Are we willing to go beyond those surface-level acts and look at why we do what we do?
It's easy to get caught up in appearances, especially with social media.
Oh, absolutely.
Where everyone's curating this perfect image of themselves.
That's a crucial point. In today's world, With social media pushing us to present this flawless version of ourselves, well, it makes genuine humility even harder.
It's like we're encouraged to be humble about, our achievements while also highlighting them for validation.
It's a strange paradox. Saadi was ahead of his time, though, in recognizing this human tendency to prioritize appearances. He constantly encourages us to look deeper, to cultivate a humility that's not for show, but for our own hearts.
So it's not about getting praise for being humble.
No.
It's about actually being humble, even when nobody's watching. That's tough.
It is. True humility isn't about performing for an audience. It's about aligning our actions with our values, even when it's difficult.
Wow.
And it reminds me of something Saadi said, actually.
What's that?
He said, whoever adorns himself with humility for people, his humility is arrogance.
Okay. Wow. That's powerful. So even appearing humble can be a form of pride.
Precisely. It's a subtle trap we can easily fall into.
That's a lot to unpack. It seems like true humility requires a deep level of self-awareness and a willingness to confront our ego.
You're absolutely right. It's an ongoing process of polishing that mirror, as Saadi says. It's a journey worth taking, even if we stumble.
Definitely. The more we practice, the more natural it becomes. This is really insightful. It's making me rethink, how I approach humility in my own life.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a lifelong process of learning and growth.
So we've talked about self-awareness, the dangers of hypocrisy, aligning our inner selves with our actions. But how does Saadi view humility in relation to others? Is this just about personal development, or is there a social dimension to it as well?
Saad emphasizes recognizing our interconnectedness, seeing ourselves as part of a larger whole. It's not just about me and my ego. It's about our place in the community, in humanity as a whole.
So humility isn't about putting ourselves down.
Not at all.
It's about raising others up, recognizing the worth of every person.
Exactly. Humility isn't self-deprecation. It's recognizing our shared humanity, treating everyone with respect and compassion, regardless of their background.
This brings us back to that idea of active humility. Can you expand on what that means?
Humility isn't about passivity. It's about actively engaging with the world in a way that embodies compassion, service, interconnectedness. It's about using our gifts to make a positive difference.
It's about living it, not just thinking or talking about it.
Exactly. It's about showing up for others in a way that reflects our understanding of our shared humanity.
Yeah.
Being present, listening deeply, acting with kindness and generosity.
That all makes sense, but it also sounds pretty challenging. How do we balance active humility with self-care?
That's a great point.
Isn't there a danger of burning out if we're constantly focused on serving others?
You're right to bring that up. And Saadi does acknowledge that need for balance. He talks about taking care of ourselves so we can better serve others.
It's like that airplane analogy, right?
Yes.
Put your oxygen mask on first before helping others.
Exactly. It highlights how important self-awareness is. We need to know our own needs and limits so we can serve from a place of wholeness.
It's a delicate dance.
It is.
This balancing act between, serving others and taking care of ourselves.
Absolutely. And Saadi reminds us that it's a lifelong journey. It's not about achieving perfect humility, but about striving to embody those values.
This has been so eye-opening. I feel like we've just, scratched the surface of Saadi's wisdom on humility. But it's a great start.
I agree. And I hope our listeners are finding this as thought-provoking as we are.
As we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to leave you all with one last thought from Saadi. He says, humility is the fruit of the tree of recognition.
I like that word.
Let's continue this exploration of Saadi's wisdom in just a moment on Wisdom Unveiled.
Yeah, that quote about humility being the fruit of recognition really gets you thinking. It's like a reminder that understanding ourselves, our place in the world, that's where it all begins, the journey to humility.
It makes me think of something else Saadi talks about, the idea that we have two selves within us. He calls them the self of proximity and the self of distance.
Another layer to understanding humility for sure, that self of proximity. That's the part of us closest to, truth, our pure essence, the part that wants connection, meaning, virtue, all that good stuff.
So it's kind of like our best self, the self that's lined up with, our values.
You could say that. The self that's drawn to what's good and true. And then there's the self of distance. That part's all about ego, desires, worldly attachments, focused on appearances, what other people think, wanting more stuff, more status, all that.
So we have this inner battle going on between our higher self and our lower self.
Exactly. And that battle is at the core of our spiritual growth. Saadi suggests that the closer we get to our self of proximity, the further we move from the self of distance. And as we get closer to, well, to truth, to our essence, we naturally become more humble.
That makes sense. The more we focus on what really matters, the less we care about, I don't know, superficial stuff, ego, status, all that. But is there a danger in focusing too much on that self of proximity?
That's an interesting thought.
Could it lead to, I don't know, maybe like a spiritual bypassing kind of thing, where we ignore real-world problems or even our own flaws?
That's insightful. It's definitely a balance. Saadi emphasizes self-awareness, not denial. Recognizing our flaws, that's part of polishing the mirror. We don't pretend to be perfect. We acknowledge our imperfections while, striving to act from our best selves.
So how do we nurture that self of proximity? How do we get closer to that truer version of ourselves without falling into that trap of, spiritual bypassing?
It's a lifelong journey. Saadi emphasizes self-reflection, examining our motivations, surrounding ourselves with people who embody those virtues we aspire to.
It sounds like it's about being intentional, both internally and externally.
Right.
Choosing what we focus on, who we spend time with. It also makes me think back to that story of the man refusing to sweep the mosque. Does that relate to all this? The self of proximity and all that?
Absolutely. It's a perfect example of this inner struggle. On the surface, refusing to sweep, you might think, oh, that's humble. But Saadi suggests it's actually the self of distance at work.
Really?
Yeah, the man's more concerned with, his perceived unworthiness than with actually serving a higher purpose.
So his ego's calling the shots, even if it looks like he's being humble.
Exactly. And that's why self-knowledge is so vital. We need to recognize the difference between actions coming from our self of proximity versus our self of distance. It's a constant process of discernment.
This raises a good point about how we actually define humility.
Right.
It's not just about what we do, it's about the state of our hearts.
Exactly.
Can't just go through the motions. We have to cultivate that inner alignment.
Yeah, you got it. It's about intentionality and recognizing that humility isn't like a destination, it's a process, always growing.
It's a journey.
Yes, constantly refining our motives and aligning our actions with our values.
Saadi's teachings, they seem so relevant to, everything going on today. In a world where everyone's all about ego and self-promotion, humility can almost feel like, I don't know, a weakness.
It's true. We're surrounded by messages that contradict humility. And that's exactly why Saadi's wisdom is so important. He reminds us that true strength comes from cultivating humility, not from feeding our egos.
It's about choosing a different path then. One that's less about, appearances and more about that inner alignment, serving something bigger than ourselves. But how do we actually bring those ancient teachings into our modern lives?
It starts with recognizing that humility isn't just a concept, it's a practice. We cultivate it through, conscious choices, daily efforts to, line up our actions with our values. It's about showing up with an open heart, ready to learn and grow.
Not about reaching some perfect state of, humility, but about making choices that move us in the right direction. It's that constant polishing, right?
Exactly. It's a journey worth taking, even with the stumbles along the way. And the more we practice, the more natural it becomes. And the more we practice humility, the more we're drawn to actions that reflect our true selves, our best intentions.
It's like a good cycle. It builds on itself.
It does. It's pretty inspiring to think about how humility can ripple outwards, from our own hearts and then influence the world around us.
That's the beautiful part, isn't it? It's not just personal transformation. It's about creating a more compassionate, interconnected world.
That's the beauty of it.
So what are some practical steps we can take to bring more humility into our lives?
Yeah.
How do we move past the theory and get into action?
Saadi gives us some good guidance. He talks about being mindful of our speech, being quick to listen, slow to speak. He also stresses practicing gratitude, recognizing what we have, not taking things for granted.
Interesting. It's not just about big gestures then. It's those small everyday things.
Exactly. Being present. Attentive to the needs of others, offering support without, expecting anything in return.
Those simple acts of kindness that often go unnoticed, but can have a huge impact.
You got it. It's about shifting the focus from ourselves to others, from me to we.
And that shift in perspective, that seems to be at the heart of it all. Saadi's teachings on humility.
It really is. It's about recognizing that we're all connected, part of something bigger than ourselves, and that naturally leads to a sense of humility.
It's letting go of that ego and embracing our shared humanity.
Beautifully said, and a beautiful way to live.
This conversation has given me a lot to think about. Saadi's wisdom really is timeless, so relevant to the challenges we all face today.
It is. He offers such profound insights into human nature and a path toward a more fulfilling, meaningful life.
Before we continue our deep dive into Saadi's wisdom on humility, I want to share something that stuck with me. Saadi says, "A humble person is like a ripe fruit. The lower it bows, the heavier it is with goodness."
That's such a powerful image.
It really captures the essence of true humility.
It does. Let's keep that in mind as we delve even deeper into Saadi's teachings here on Wisdom Unveiled.
Yeah, that image of the ripe fruit, bowing down, full of goodness. It's such a beautiful way to think about humility. It's not about making ourselves smaller, it's about recognizing how full we are and sharing that with the world.
It really does illustrate the paradox of humility, that by lowering ourselves, we actually become stronger, more virtuous. True strength isn't in arrogance, it's in the willingness to, bend, serve.
It's like that saying, the greatest among you will be your servant.
Exactly. Saadi stresses that real leadership, it comes from service, from understanding that we're all connected and that, our well-being depends on everyone else's well-being too.
This idea of service being leadership, it's so profound. It really challenges how we usually think about leadership. It's not about power and control. It's about
empowering others.
Yeah, not about putting ourselves on a pedestal.
You got it. He constantly reminds us that humility isn't about dimming our own light. It's about making space for others to shine. And that true fulfillment, it doesn't come from just looking out for ourselves. It comes from contributing to something bigger.
It's about that me to we shift.
Precisely. And that shift, it changes everything. It helps us move past the limits of our ego and tap into, the potential of our shared humanity. It's limitless.
It's like we're expanding that circle of compassion from ourselves to our families, to our communities, and ultimately to all of humanity.
Yes, and that expansion of compassion, that's the key to building a more just, harmonious world. Saadi believed that a society thrives when people, when they prioritize each other's well-being, when they practice humility, generosity, kindness.
It's pretty amazing to think about how those, simple virtues can make such a big difference. It makes you wonder, what if we all, really tried to be more humble in our daily lives?
I think we'd see a huge change. More cooperation, more understanding, more peace. We'd move away from all that, division and self-serving stuff we see so much of these days, and towards a more compassionate, connected way of being.
That's a beautiful vision, and one that, feels really important right now.
It does, and it starts with each of us, with that willingness to, to cultivate humility in our hearts and our minds. It's about understanding our interconnectedness, practicing gratitude, and, serving others generously and kindly.
It's about remembering that ripe fruit, bowing low, full of goodness, ready to share.
Beautifully said. And as we wrap up this deep dive into Saadi's wisdom on humility, let's hold on to that image. Let's try to embody that spirit of generosity and kindness in everything we do.
Thank you for joining us on Wisdom Unveiled. May your journey be filled with wisdom, compassion, and the transformative power of humility.